And as James mentioned, Jamie and I have been working together on this project on alcohol, race and ethnicity, which examines how racial stereotypes about drinking have developed in the United States, Mexico and globally across the 19th and 20th century. And our paper today forms part of that project. So to give you a bit of a scope of the project as a whole before we get stuck in, the whole project looks at discussions or representations of drinking behaviours through heightened points of international exchange, particularly the Mexican-American War, international exhibitions, international temperance activity, and international anti-alcohol conferences, and the latter of those is what we're concentrating on today. Jamie's really been leading that work on the anti-alcohol conferences, as this strand of research intersects very nicely with his broader experience and expertise on the role of similar congresses or conventions through which regulatory frameworks for other intoxicants like opium and cannabis were being built in broadly similar time periods. So Jamie's going to take us to the 1927 World League Against Alcoholism Congress to begin.
Lovely, thanks Deborah. In his keynote speech at the 1927 World League Against Alcohol at Winona Lake in Indiana, Dr. Ernest H. Charrington, who is pictured on slide now, took to the stage to elucidate the lofty values of which he believed the efforts of the League rested. Most poignantly, Charrington took a sense of pride in declaring that the World League did not emphasize the differences between men and races and nations. Instead, the League's goal was to focus on the points in which there is agreement. And kind of reading this through a couple of times, you really get this sense that the World League was trying to position itself as being based on these ideas of a pragmatic, egalitarian, and maybe even emancipatory fraternship for all nations fighting against the evils of alcohol, regardless of their colour or creed. And yet, in the very same speech, in fact, like a couple of paragraphs down from this, Charrington would also go on to note that one of the League's chief aims was to protect child races and backwards people, as they called it, from the ravages of alcohol. And as some people may not be surprised to learn, this wasn't like kind of an isolated or unique incident. And in fact, these kind of paternalistic attitudes towards non-white people and their relationship with alcohol, which is often framed as harmful, were pretty pivotal to international temperance activism during the 19th and 20th century. In turn, what me and Deborah are going to argue today is that international forums for the discussion of temperance, such as the World League and the international conferences, were spaces in which ideas about the relationship between alcohol and race and its various kind of like issues were presented, consolidated, and shared between different nations. So in today's presentation, what we're going to be looking at is papers that were presented before various international anti-alcohol conferences between 1885 and 1939 to explore how ideas about racial difference featured strongly in discussions about the problems related with drinking at various places across the world. And we're going to basically roughly group these into three different themes. The first of them we're going to look at is colonial alcohol policies and how they are framed in paternalist attitudes about protecting populations from alcohol. Secondly, we're going to look at kind of like inverting the lens and looking at discussions about European drinking practices and the impact this was seen to have upon colonial populations. And then finally, we're going to look at how the language of race became entangled in discussions of particular nations and peoples and their drinking habits.
And just to note at the outset as well that the plan is to develop this paper further into an analysis of how concepts of alcoholism specifically as a medical or psychiatric condition or a behavioural problem was formulated through these discussions at the conferences and embedded ideas about racial difference in a variety of ways, but we haven't made it that far yet, but that's kind of where this is going in the future.
Also to piggyback off that as well, we'd really appreciate any comments as we kind of push on forward, and I'm sure Deborah kind of agrees with that. Yeah. So to kind of provide some context then for the discussions that we'll be talking about, with the rise of internationalism in the 19th and early 20th century, there was a growing number of meetings that were adjourned to address various global problems, including what was seen as the global problem of alcohol. And the first of these conferences, the Antwerp Meeting Against the Abuse of Alcoholic Beverages, took place in 1885, with a further 21 conferences against alcoholism taking place by the start of the Second World War. There are also a number of other subsidiary meetings that we'll kind of touch on as well during this paper, one of them including the World League that I've just mentioned, which was an offshoot of the American Anti-Saloon League. These conferences are quite interesting, and this is sort of the reason we gravitated towards them, because they brought together delegates from an increasingly large array of different countries and territories and colonies to discuss problems relating to alcohol. They drew together the discussion of alcohol with much broader social issues as well, such as national health, economic prosperity, and European colonialism. This meant, kind of as a knock-on effect, that it didn't just attract temperance organisations and their ability to discuss activities stemming from it, but also experts from a range of other academic disciplines as well, such as sociologists, medical doctors, psychiatrists, and racial hygienists. As a knock-on effect of that as well, the papers covered a really broad array of issues as well, relating to medical, social, economic, and political topics that kind of related to opium. Johan Hedman, who people may or may not have heard of, has already written 2 really good articles about the conferences, both in the pre-war and then post-First World War period, and has kind of looked at their impact, how they were set up, and argued that they functioned as key sites in which international knowledge and policy in the alcohol field were disseminated amongst delegates. And what we want to turn to in the rest of this paper is kind of look at how they were spaces not just for these engagements and exchanges, but also for ideas about racial difference and how they related to the discussion of problems relating from alcohol.
So the first theme then we're exploring, as Jamie mentioned at the outset, is the role of race in shaping colonial alcohol policies. Now, there's already quite an extensive history on how anti-alcohol groups, including the congresses that we're studying, debated the impact of imported European liquors or distilled spirits on colonized peoples in Africa, especially in West Africa. So scholars, couple we've put on the slide here, such as Olorunfemi and Olukoju, have shown that increasingly restrictive alcohol regulations, including various types of prohibition, in British West Africa, were informed by a paternalistic sentiment towards African peoples, ultimately being based on the premise that Africans lacked willpower and self-discipline and therefore needed greater degrees of protection from alcohol than Europeans. And so typically at these anti-alcohol conferences, these issues were raised in papers and discussions about the effects of alcohol on the quote-unquote native races, the language that they used. Reverend Charles Hartford, for example, who was a former British missionary to Nigeria, noted in 1919 that the importation of European spirits has had only one effect, and that is to injure the physique as well as to degrade the morals of the African tribes. Similarly, Mrs. Henry Peabody noted that no race is so quickly and so utterly demoralized by the strong drink, a situation that she attributed to the self-interest of colonial governments in selling distilled spirits within the colonies. Now, what the congresses as a whole have made apparent through our research, though, is that these types of racialized concerns about alcohol use amongst colonial populations were by no means unique to the African context or to British colonialism. Instead, papers presented from a range of different nations stressed the terrible effects of alcohol upon colonial populations across the globe. So in the case of Dutch Java, for instance, Mr. A. Walbeam noted that the Javanese population were sliding ever further on the sloping surface of alcoholism, and this necessitated a ban on alcohol for natives in Java and Madura. Similarly, a Reverend Rouse from Rotterdam noted that the Dutch government was actively seeking to check the alcohol danger in its Indian colonies, adding that it went without saying that colonial powers must do all they can to defend the native population from the danger of alcohol that menaces them. Likewise, several papers presented before the 1934 Congress in London drew attention to the demoralising influence of alcohol upon the Maori of New Zealand. So in a paper delivered by Miss Maclay, for instance, she noted that since the early days of European settlement, the Maori leaders have been well aware of the terrible havoc wrought by strong drink. And similar sentiments were echoed in a paper by J. Moulton Murray, the General Secretary of the New Zealand Temperance Alliance, which stressed that the Maori knew nothing of intoxicating liquors before European colonialism, and their spread represented a dark blot on the national history. So as in the case of Africa, that's been well studied in the historiography, these sorts of paternalistic colonial attitudes were underpinned by ideas of racial difference, that the so-called native races of various colonies around the world were unable to control their own drinking habits and thus had to be protected through European interventions in law and regulatory frameworks.
Cool. So to sort of invert things a little bit, on the other side of the coin, in the context of European colonialism, it wasn't just native populations that writers were keen to sort of disparage, but also the drinking habits of Europeans. In particular, they kind of stressed the failings of prominent Europeans to set good examples to colonial populations, kind of providing the example which they tended to follow. And of course, we've got to acknowledge that these ideas hinged upon racist conceptualizations about the inferiority of colonized peoples. But because they point to the expectations placed upon European colonizers as being more enlightened, they're also quite interesting because they kind of illustrate how a failure to meet perceived standards and perceived sort of goals of behavior sort of endangered the racial hierarchies in which colonial projects across the world were sort of pinned upon. I think it's important to note that we aren't the first to acknowledge this. Harold Fisher-Tinney has noted before an interesting form of this phenomenon in colonial India, where he notes how various Anglo-Indian populations, so that's white but born in or mainly living in India at the time, kind of presented really bad examples that sort of risked the reputation of the Raj by kind of like challenging the superiority of Europeans upon which colonialism was based. But what also kind of comes apparent through reading the anti-alcohol conferences that actually this concern was much more widespread and evident outside of India as well. So as a number of papers that were presented before the conferences acknowledged, colonial subjects were apparently all too quick to imitate the habits which they observed amongst the European elite. For example, Reverend Rawls noted in 1911 that the drinking habits of Europeans have done much to spread the tanking of drink among the natives, a fact which he said was exacerbated by the quote-unquote childlike desire of Africans to imitate. Similarly, a paper by John Springer at the World Leagues Conference of 1927 noted that based upon his experiences in the Belgian Congo, the examples of men of our race who are in positions of high responsibility in foreign lands, men who frequently live dissolute private lives, has a very baneful effect and sets a very bad example to the African populations there. So I guess what we're trying to get at is that at the heart of these concerns, these anxieties were more about just the poor example which prominent Europeans were seen to set to colonial populations. Instead, it was also about like the tensions which underpin the more fundamental idea of colonialism as a civilizing mission. This idea that colonialism was about uplifting like colonial populations, and that by kind of doing the opposite of that, by spreading bad habits, it was sort of the paradox that kind of brought colonialism into critique. And so in proposing what they saw as the solution to this paradox, papers stressed the need that Europeans should take the lead and set an example for colonial populations by becoming abstinent, basically. So consequently, missionaries such as Rawls noted that in order to obtain prohibition, it was necessary that whites in the colonies abstain from spirits altogether, as to encourage an obedience amongst colonial subjects to follow similar patterns as well. Thus, what the papers presented revealed that race was not only central to constructing ideas about how people should and shouldn't drink amongst colonial populations, but also about what the impact of like non sort of satisfactory or problematic drinking habits posed amongst Europeans as well.
And so then to move on to our third theme, delegates at the anti-alcohol conferences sometimes use the language of race to describe characteristic drinking styles of whole nations as either being distinctively problematic or not. And this contributed to what we'd call an essentialization of the drinking habits of specific national, ethnic, and social groups, with papers speaking of the drinking habits of this race or the sobriety of that race as if these traits were hard-coded and uniformly true within different national or other contexts. And so exactly the relationship between these three themes and how they're using notions of race in different ways is something we're still kind of thinking about and unpacking. But for now, just to note that some of the examples of this type of sort of referring to entire nations as races in this regard. So speaking in relation to Japan, for instance, Reverend Hennigar noted that the drinking habits of the people have ever been different to those in most Western lands, adding that the Japanese should be described as steady rather than moderate drinkers with these spells of excess. In another example, Reverend Hammond noted that the Australian people as a whole are self-indulgent, adding that restraint in moral forms is foreign to their nature. And this process of essentialization went beyond just missionary efforts to offer generalized perspectives on different populations. Other examples show that evocations of peoplehood, nationhood, and in a way race, were becoming central to assertions of national sovereignty in some contexts, as past struggles and future aspirations were increasingly stressed in relation to peoplehood amongst the fledgling states that were founded following World War I. So, for example, representative for Latvia, Mr. Davis, lamented his country's prior alcoholization by Russian and German governments, stressing that a key goal of the newly found state of Latvia was to make the country free from the curse of alcoholism.
Looking more towards home, participants in conferences also used the language of race to characterize the drinking habits of the lower classes, which it increasingly saw as a race apart or seemed to kind of configure within racialized language. By aligning its lower classes with those of the colonial or indigenous populations, and by invoking tropes that were evident in discussions of the former, temperance activists essentially racialized the habits of the lower class, we argue, as something that was fundamentally different from their own. So in the case of Brazil, for instance, in 1927, their representatives at the conference aligned the drinking of cachaça amongst the lower classes, which is expanded by Europeans, by mostly European immigrants, with that of the indigenous population, noting that the beverage was a drink of choice for both the labouring man and the Indians in the interior, who are very much little removed from their primitive state. In other cases, meanwhile, the difference of the lower classes was emphasised by descriptions of their often violent behaviours under drink, and how that kind of drew parallels to colonial populations. So in discussing alcohol control in Manitoba and Canada, for example, a paper noted the cruel sufferings and wrongs which were to be found in the trail of the liquor traffic, noting instances such as a young mother who was forced into the night with her child after being chased by a drunk, crazed husband, and then a wife who was beaten to death in a drunken fury by her husband. And of course, the figure of the drunken, violent, and even murderous male was a common facet in temperate literature at the time. But what we want to kind of go on to add is that such tropes also bore a stark resemblance to the presentation of drinking habits amongst non-European populations as well. So there's a sense of equivalence. So for instance, a paper by Linfield recounted the observations that he'd heard from the Bishop of Accra in the Gold Coast, who noted that...
Sorry to interrupt, this is just the 2-minute warning.
Cool, thank you. So observations from the Bishop of Accra and the Gold Coast noted that for a week at a time, every man and woman, and not a few children, are drunk, some in a torpid, some in a raving condition. And again, while these comparisons didn't directly draw a parallel between the habits of the lower class and the European populations, there's this heavy emphasis on violent, maddening, and degenerative effects of alcohol, which hint that the working class were in some way in as much need of moral guidance as colonial populations as well. So we're going to wrap up now. We're at a 2-minute warning, so good timing. So in conclusion, what we've been trying to show here is that the papers printed at various international alcohol conferences reveal how important race was as a category through which the concerns and problems related with alcohol were constructed and communicated to international audiences. So for instance, we've kind of talked about how important race was to discussions of alcohol use amongst colonial populations, not just in West Africa, which Deborah has mentioned some discussed quite a lot already, but also across European colonies more broadly. Also, it looks at how ideas about kind of the vulnerability of colonial populations and their need to be protected, and the racialized language used to justify that was seen as kind of a central criticism of alcohol policies. But to turn this on its head as well, these kind of like criticisms were not just aimed at kind of like colonial populations, but also colonizers themselves, arguing that they set a poor example for their colonial populations who are all too eager to follow them. And what we've kind of done is try to go beyond just kind of like the obvious examples and also add that notions of race aren't just kind of like central to talking about non-European populations, but also about European populations as well. In particular, that kind of like notions of race or racialized difference are not just used kind of as a collective grouping mechanism for like national habits and peoplehood, but also kind of used as a way to sort of like depict the drinking classes of the drinking habits of the lower classes sort of as a race apart, effectively kind of creating, if not direct, but certainly implicit parallels between both the lower classes and colonized peoples and their kind of need for sort of shepherding. But that is all from us. So thank you very much.